Attributes define the data that's stored inside of an object. It's the information that describes that object better. And so the important thing about objects is it should come from that real world object and the things that that real world object keeps track of. So if you remember what we were talking about before, it's how much, it's where at, or who, or how, or stuff like that. So a product has a name, a price, a weight. Those are things that when you go look at a product, you physically grab in your hand, you can see a price on it. You can see a UPC code on it. You can see different attributes of that product. And you can see the other classes, quantity and subtotal, and those types of examples. It's important that we don't just arbitrarily throw data around, because you got to remember, each object gets its own copy of each of these data items. If it's stuff that's not in common for every object, or stuff that is common for every object, doesn't change from each object, then you don't want to put it in that object. You want to find a different place for it. So, for instance, sales tax. It's not appropriate to put sales tax on each product, because each product has the same sales tax. Doesn't matter, and we'll ignore it for the moment. Different sales tax tiers, but let's just say you're selling CDs. Every CD has the same sales tax on it. It's not like Michael Bolton has higher taxes on it than Dr. Dre or something like that. So every CD has the same sales tax on it. So you wouldn't store that. You'd have a separate class, a separate object that keeps track of the sales tax, perhaps by the state or something like that. So it's important to design your code so that the things that get copied every single time are the things that are unique every single time. So the attributes describes the class in a way that is unique to that class. Now, one of the associations we talk about, that's the relationships between objects, is an object keeping track of another object. And as we saw when we were talking about objects, we do that through the name of the class. So the line item had a reference to the product class that was called sold. The order has a reference to a bunch of line items class, which is the list of line items inside of there, all the line items that are part of an order. And the line in UML shows the association, which in Java turns into an attribute. And so when we have this relationship inside of there, you have attributes like integers, or attributes like strings, or attributes like dates. Well, we can also have the classes that we create, those relationships. Now, technically, strings and dates are objects, and they are pointing to other classes, but we don't tend to think of them that way so much in Java. But we have mostly the primitive variables outside of there, and then we also have the associations to other classes. So again, like we said, the line item keeps track of the product. That sort of thing happens inside of here. We do it by having the class name, and then whatever our relationship defined by the variable name inside of our class. So what makes it a variable and attribute? I mean, there's lots of variables inside of there, but it's about the scope. It's where it lives inside of our class. So if I have the attribute inside the class, so between the curly brackets, the start and end curly brackets of the class, but it's outside of all of the methods. So in this case, there's one method in the class, do stuff. So that makes this an attribute of the class. You can see the curly brackets inside of this method, the do stuff, I have a local variable that lives inside here because it's inside these curly brackets. If it had a parameter to this method, it would be a parameter, not an attribute. So the attributes live outside of the rest of the methods, but inside of the class. They're given a visibility type, which we'll learn more about. Private and public, the most common. Public, everybody can see it. Private, only I can see it inside the class. They each have to have a type, integer, or some other class name, or float, or long, or doubled, or boolean, or whatever it's going to be, and then the name of the attribute itself. Again, the name of the attribute should be describing the real world thing that's being put out as part of the class. So how many attributes can a class have? Well, it can have any number of attributes there. Here's the little test for you. How many attributes do you see in this class? So pause this video if you want to. I'll give you a second to look at it. But look through all of the items here, and then I'll walk through here in a second, and we'll look at each of these and tell you what it is or what it isn't as far as attributes go. So pause now. Okay, so hopefully you've paused. Hopefully you've counted them up. Let's talk through each one of these one at a time. So we have a class named product. You see, have the open curly bracket and closed curly bracket at the end of the class. Up here, we have two funny looking ones because they're capitalized. Do you know why they're capitalized? Well, if you look at it, public final int single 1, public final int set 1. So public means it's visible to everybody. Final means it's a constant. It can be set once and only once. Hopefully you remember that. Int is the type. It's an integer, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, minus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that sort of thing. The name of it is, since it's a constant, capital letters, single, and its initial value is 1. For whatever reason, it also set the initial value of set to 1. I don't know why. It's just the way the code is. But there's two attributes of the class. Now, since it's final, that means it won't be set and it's the same value for every one of these product classes. So it's kind of a little bit of a wasted effort right here. This is what I was talking about not necessarily the best idea, because now every time I have products, let's say I have 10 products, well, there's 10 copies of this constant value. That's the same value across all of them. So it's not the most inefficient thing ever, but it's slightly inefficient. It's not the best. The way you could get rid of that is you could take these two attributes, put it in a different class, or you can make them static final inside of here, which would mean they're class attributes instead of attributes of the object. Now, that's really the only time I would recommend using static is for final things, constants, but it is a valuable way of making it happen. All right, so next thing we see here is the price, set price method here. So this is a method we can tell because it has a return type. We'll see that. We'll talk about that in the next video. But that's just one little way because it also says public here. And then this double right here, you can see this is a data type. This is a parameter that's being passed into that because we can see by the parentheses. Again, we'll learn more about methods here a little bit later. And so the beginning curly bracket, end curly bracket, this is the inside of the method. So everything that happens inside of here is part of the behavior of this method. So that means double adjusted right here. This is a local variable, not an attribute. So after the end of this method, you have int ID. So no public or private. Is that acceptable? It is actually. It's called default. This is the default visibility. And it's not quite as private, but it's also not public. So most of the rest of the Java can't see this. Only if you're in the same package can you see these three variables. But here's an integer, a number, ID, a string variable. So this is an association to another object, which is a string, name, and then a local variable double price. I'm sorry, an attribute price. So there's 3, 4, 5 attributes in this class. So hopefully you saw that from the code. That's a little bit there, but this is the type of thing we're going to be building right along. And again, you can see from the product, we have an ID of the product, we have the name of the product, we have a price of the product. These are all three logical things to describe a product. All right, so we'll learn more about methods next, but attributes are really key to describing the data that all objects of that class know about and what uniquely they know about so they can be worked with within the methods.